Okay, so last time we just started the Middle Ages last time, and we talked about Byzantine art. So we were over in the East. Hi, that's okay. Come on in. We're just now starting, so you haven't missed anything at all. That's the
I
same.
couldn't find my hearing aids, and I knew if
Well,
I
that
could, I
doesn't
might as
help.
well stay home.
Right, well, good.
Silence your phone. You got your phone off? Huh?
Phone's off.
Phone's off.
Reminds me Bonnie's not going to make it today.
I had to get up here so I could sit at the table. Sure.
Again, push up a little bit.
I'm sorry, you caused trouble. Well, then I better get busy. Oh, the troublemaker.
Okay, so anyway, we were looking at Byzantine, and the last thing I talked about was eventually the Byzantine Empire fell to the Ottoman Turks. And this is just an image of the Ottoman Empire. You could see that after this, they really controlled not only Constantinople, but a good part of Eastern Europe, North Africa, and the like. So we're going to leave the Byzantine Empire behind now. We looked at a couple things, but I really want to focus mostly on Western Europe. So now we're going back to the fall of Rome again, but now we're going to look at what happens in the West, what happens to the Western part of the empire, because that's really European culture. Now,
That was one long-lasting empire.
yeah, business. Yeah, I mean, yeah, the Ottomans. Yeah, the Ottomans were. Yeah, and it doesn't fall until 1922 when Turkey is established. So yeah, it's a very, very long time. It's not this big, of course, until like 15th century. They don't really like move past Constantinople, but it's a very important empire. It's something we don't study a lot in Western history, unfortunately, because it's just a little further east, and so Europe doesn't pay that much attention to it. But you know, the role in World War I was very important.
At this time, mostly a Muslim.
Yeah, entirely. The Ottoman Empire is entirely Muslim. And in fact, you know, in 1914, they're beginning to collapse. And the vacuum created in this part of the world with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire is really what led to World War I. World War I was all about who's going to take control of this part of the world, this vacuum left by the withdrawing Ottomans. So, you know, they continue well into the 20th century to be very important.
Yeah.
But reminding you of what's going on in Western Europe, sure.
Was Tripoli a country sort of, you know, from the halls of
That's Tripoli, yeah, that's
we fought in Tripoli because
right. Right. We were fighting in World War I. Yeah, Tripoli is, it was part of World War I. 1914, 15.
No, when they fought in Tripoli, it was very early in our life, and they were pirates, and so I just, you know, from the shores of Tripoli, and that's
right before World War I.
Yeah.
I'm gonna look that up.
Maybe it was just
no, it could be. I don't know a lot about that. I guess I kind of thought it was World War I, but that was just, you know, in my head. Doesn't mean it's true.
But that was part of
With that
Corinth once, wasn't it?
okay.
The Corinthians first. I mean,
Not Corinthians. You mean the Carthaginians?
Yeah.
Yeah, Corinthians are in Greece. Carthaginians are in North Africa. That's okay. You're forgiven. Remember all of those tribes that were coming into the Western Empire? This is where they are by about 500. They've sort of coalesced into these are not like countries, they're not unified. This is sort of roughly where the Frankish tribes are located, where the Ostrogoths are located, and they did eventually capture Ravenna. We talked about that when we looked at the Byzantine Empire, but these are the kingdoms. Well, they're not quite kingdoms yet. They're a little more loosely grouped than that. But we're going to talk about all this part of the world and what happens here. But I want to begin by looking at what's happening in Britain. We've already looked at early Christian art in Rome. under Constantine. You know, we saw Old St. Peter's, the first church, talked a little bit about that. But now we're going to see as Christianity is spreading throughout Europe, and it spreads fairly quickly. This period of around the early 600s, say, much of Europe is Christianized by that time. Through the 500s, Christianity is spreading. And I want to look at the British Isles because some important things happen here. Of all of these peoples that are migrating and down into Southern Europe, there are other peoples who are migrating straight across and into Britain, and particularly a lot of different tribal groups who moved across Northern Europe. Now, the significance of that is these are people who never encountered the Roman Empire. You know, the power and influence of the Roman Empire is profound, but there are still people who moved across this area after the fall of Rome and really aren't influenced by that culture. And a lot of them moved into Britain. And let's talk about Britain and the sort of history of Britain and who's moving into that area. As soon as I move my zoomies, sorry, zoomies, move you down into the corner so we can see our map. Okay, we know there are people living in the British Isles very early in the Neolithic period. We don't really know how early there were human beings there, but there were certainly in the Neolithic, the Old Stone Age, people in Britain. And we know because these are the people that built Stonehenge. These are the earliest Britons. Down to about 1200, this is when we have the 1200 BCE, after Stonehenge was built. This is when the various Celts moved into the region. About 1200 to 1000, many different Celts, the Gaels, the Picts, the Britons, and there are many, many tribes of Celts that moved into this region. When we talked about Stonehenge, I mentioned that many people see it and talk about it as if it's a Celtic monument, and it's not. They did use it. You know, when they come in, they'll be the ones who are using Stonehenge, but they didn't build it. It was built by earlier people. But the people we're interested in is a much later immigration of peoples that has to do with this migrations across Europe. And that is when the Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians move into this area. And these are the people that are, when they come into the area, they're not Christian yet. They're still what are considered pagan tribes, but they will be Christianized, converted fairly quickly. The Saxons are a Dutch people. Saxons, Angles, and Jutes. No, the Saxons, Angles, and Frisians are basically Dutch, where the Jutes are Danish, but they're all people moving across this area. And it's these styles, Northern European style, that we're going to see influencing this part of the world. The Vikings come later, and I'll mention them briefly because they do affect things. And then, of course, much later, the Norman invasion from France. So this is basically the history of invasions of Britain, simplified absurdly, but nonetheless, that's what we're talking about here. There's one group of people I want to say something about. They're this interesting tribal group known as the Scythians. The Scythians lived BC, they're about 800 to 400 BCE. The Scythians lived in areas that are now sort of Kazakhstan and all of this part of the region of southern Russian area. Even in Parthia, they were a warrior people, nomadic warrior people, and during their time, they ranged throughout much of Asia and Europe. They're not affiliated with any particular other nation other than their own. Scythians always get sort of left out of the discussion because they don't really fit in anywhere. They're just who they are. But the influence of Scythians is really profound across Asia and Europe. There's one particular style associated with them, and it's something we call the animal style. It's a style of metalwork designed, and this is Scythian This is a pectoral, which is basically like a necklace, a big neck piece. And it's carved with fine detailed metalwork, centering around animals that are very dynamic, often fictitious animals, things we saw developing in the Near East, in the ancient world. And nomadic peoples often have a strong tradition in metalwork, because if you're nomadic and you're moving around, working with metals is small things you can carry with you. And they spread this style. You see Scythian influence in ancient Greece, throughout Rome. You see it in China. You see it all over because they're just here and they're gone. You know, they never settle anywhere and build a kingdom. That's why, you know, where do I talk about them? We talk about empires and kingdoms, but that's not what they were. They were just people that were moving everywhere. But while they were doing it, they were dropping off these styles and influencing people. And I mention that because we're going to see that in Britain. There's a strong Scythian influence. Now, they were never in Britain, but all these people who migrated into Britain passed through territories where the Scythians had been, and they picked up these metalwork skills, and it becomes often a style that people refer to as a Celtic style today. And it really doesn't have anything to do with the Celts. It's British, but it's really Scythian. It's from Western Asia. And I want to first look at a site.
Are those carved? Those aren't carved. Those are
No, they're
milled?
cast. They're cast.
Okay, thank
Yeah, they're cast often in gold, silver, precious materials. So no, it's cast metalwork. I want to look at the site known as Sutton Hoo, a really, really important early site discovered in 1939 and excavated at that time. There's actually a book and a movie about Sutton Hoo. If you've not encountered it, they both have the same title. It's called The Dig. And the movie, which is fairly recent, it's just called The Dig. It's on Netflix if you want to learn the story of how this was discovered and excavated. I watched about half of it, so I'm not 100% sure about how accurate it all is. But anyway, it's interesting about how this site was discovered.
What's the name again on that?
The Dig.
The
The Dig. And I think it's 2020, or even maybe 21, I'm not sure. It's about this pre-Christian site. Yeah, did you?
No.
Oh, okay. Usually referred to as barbarian, but I'm going to call it pre-Christian. But it's key because as we'll look at some things from it in a moment, it dates to 625, and 625 is a moment in Britain where Christianity is there. There are monasteries going up. There are also pagan tribes. It's right at this moment of transition. This is a pagan burial, and we'll explain when we look at some things from it how you know it's pagan, not only because you don't find crosses, you don't find Christian symbolism, but there are other reasons. It's a buried ship. It's a large ship that was buried underground in this very acidic soil. So the wood from the ship is gone, but it left its impression. So all that's left is the impression of the ship and all the things that were in the ship. So there are all sorts of objects that were in the ship, metal work, all sorts of things just laying there in the dirt, but they were originally sort of in the ship itself. It's an Anglo-Saxon culture, and it's associated with the burial of King Raywald, who's a very well-known Anglo-Saxon king who died in 625. And we know this from coinage and other things on the site. This is his burial. The idea of burying a ship, this was a way of burying people, especially a king. I mean, everybody doesn't get buried in a ship, but he's a king. One of the things we find in what is known as the Sutton Hoo Treasury, it's one of the most famous excavated sites, and it's absolutely filled with this marvelous metal work in this animal style detail. We know they were masters at it. So it's considered Anglo-Saxon, perhaps with a little Celtic, because the Celts were still there.
Where is that stuff?
It's all in the British Museum, the whole Sutton Hoo Treasury. it's one of the few things in the British Museum that is British. That, you know, there's a reason why it's there, and it's rightfully there. Yeah,
That's gold, isn't it?
yeah, it's just beautiful. It's about like 4
What
inches.
is it?
It is a hinged clasp, and it's one half would, it's like to attach a garment at the shoulder. So you would have like a piece of fabric here, one half would be here, the other half would be attached to the back, and then you bring them together. I'll show you the back of it in a minute and you could see, but you know, it fits together like this, and then that pin slides in. So it's like a hinged clasp, just like it says.
Where are the animals? It says
Yeah,
animals.
well, that we'll look at some detail and see if we can figure it out, because it's not easy to recognize what the animals actually are. There's a lot of actually silver wire being used to put this together, a lot of gold, a lot of garnets and semi-precious stones, and enameling glass with colored glass. It's referred to as millefiori. Millefiori means literally 1,000,000 colors, but it's the name for certain sorts of glass work. I mean, the fine detail here is really hard to imagine. All these fanciful, here's some like animal forms. These are like bird beaks. They're very abstracted. You know, it's not naturalistic, but you can see like an eye here and a beak of forms that are all intertwined. This is the back, so you can see it has these sort of like little hook claws that would grab onto your garments and hook them together. Here's a closer detail where you can see, I've seen this described in different ways. I have looked this 1,000,000 times and I still can't see the animals that they're describing, but there's something, some people apparently can see like a wild boar or something, which, you know, we could spend the next hour trying to find it, so I'm not going to stay on this forever. But trust me, some people say there's abstracted animals in here, and I will believe them. This is supposedly like tails or something, but you know, I don't know, it's beyond me. I can see these animals, you know, I can see these birds, but look at the tiny detail. The whole thing is 4 inches, so you can imagine how tiny these little spaces are. But metal work and this style is very important because it's going to go on to influence other art. There's a lot of granulation. See this little tiny thing? Each one of those is a tiny little bead of gold that is individually soldered in place, and they're like grains of sand, big, placed in that spot. That's the kind of metalwork. This is the granulation is all here. See all these little, those are all little grains of gold. Called granulation. This is my favorite piece from Sutton Hoo, and because there's 1,000,000 of them, there's lots of this stuff. This is a purse lid. It was about, I think, 8 inches across. And the white background is gone. That was broken out. They've just put that white. There was originally bone in there, but that's broken out. So it's bone, gold, silver, and a lot of enameling. Enamel is basically glass, liquid glass with pigment and color added to it, and then it's sort of poured in there while it's still liquid, and then it cools. That's the enameling process.
What did you say was there before?
Bone. The white was bone. The background was originally bone. Now this was a clasp. It's okay, no problem. These are hinges at the top. So this was attached to a bag, probably made of leather. Now the bag is gone. It got eaten up in the acid soil, but it held a lot of coins because this was found like on top of a stack of coins. So there was a leather pouch. This was the clasp over it that would, you know, you would lift. And so the coins remain and the metal from the clasp remains where the leather bag itself was gone. But here we've got, we can see more of these animal forms. You've got 2 fantastic animals here. One attacking another. Some people identify it as like some sort of prey bird, and then a smaller attacking a duck, like an eagle attacking a duck is so it's sometimes, but you know, they're so abstracted you can't really tell, but they're two birds. And then over here, two animals, maybe wolves of some kind, whatever, on either side of a man. And I've got some better detail here. Here's the two animals on either side of a stylized human figure. Now we're getting tiny, tiny again. And look at all these little metal wire pieces with the enameling within them. Now we've seen this design before. Does this look familiar? It's that heraldic design. I called it a heraldic design, and we saw it as early as Sumerian art, where we saw the male figure with the two animals on either side. We know that's from the Middle East, that developed in the area of Sumer, and we know the Scythians were in and out of that area. It's likely that this style moved westward along with Scythian metalwork and other designs. So it's interesting to trace the movements of people. You can see how these styles developed. We know that originally it symbolized some sort of like guardians and protection. So maybe that's what it symbolizes here. It's hard to really know for sure. Okay. Christianity enters England at the same time all this is happening. That's much earlier. Nobody knows when the first monastery, and we're going to talk about monasticism in much more detail later. Nobody knows when the first monastery in Ireland was constructed, but we do know that when St. Patrick arrived in 432, there was at least one monastery there because he went there. He didn't build it. It was there when he got there. And we know that St. Patrick handed out a lot of books to monasteries and churches, so they had to be there. So at least by 432, and that's a lot earlier than even parts of the mainland. I'm not quite sure how it got up to Ireland. And from Ireland, it moved into England, Scotland, Wales, etc. But Ireland was first. We know that St. Benedict, it moved eastward from Ireland. It got somehow from Rome up into Europe, and then someone came up to Ireland, and then from Ireland moved down into Irish monks brought it.
But before all this happened, the Romans left.
Romans were long gone. The Romans were gone by 300 or so, 350, they were gone. So the Romans are definitely long gone. And if there were Romans there, they would have been Christian anyway, because the Western Empire was Christianized.
Well, what happened in England after the Romans left? I mean, until...
Well, basically, that's when all these other people are moving in. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. They just sort of went back to who they were. Now, this says St. Benedict founded the first monastery. What that should say is St. Benedict founded his first monastery, not the first monastery, his first monastery there. And St. Benedict is important because he wrote the so-called rules, the rules of St. Benedict. And the rules of St. Benedict were a set of rules for monasteries, behavior in monasteries, and they were embraced and spread into all sorts of other monasteries. They're not just in Benedictine monasteries. The rule of St. Benedict was embraced by a great many monasteries. The very first monasteries were Christian monasteries, were in Egypt, St. Anthony and others. Monastic tradition developed long before Christianity. As early as 1500 BC, you have the Vedas in India talked about asceticism. Ascetics were a part of the Vedic tradition. And asceticism is basically like going out, living as a hermit alone in caves or whatever. And from that tradition of isolated asceticism, what happened fairly early was ascetics would come together. You got, 2 or 3 hermits out there, and they kind of come together, and pretty soon a bunch of hermits come together, and they're still isolated from society and the community, but it's a shared communal isolation. And that's really the origin of monasticism. It's formalized under Buddhism. When the Buddha comes along in like the 6th century BCE, he formalizes the idea of a monastery. So they predate Christianity, but Saint Anthony, as early as the 4th century in Egypt, you also have then Christian ascetics who go out and live in caves, and then they come together, and so that's really the origin of the monastic community. From Ireland, one of the most important sites founded by St. Columba was a monastery on an island up here called Iona, and that is a very important place, founded by Irish monks. And from Iona, many of the most important monasteries in Britain were founded, particularly Lindisfarne and Jarrow. And we're going to talk about Lindisfarne and Jarrow and Weymouth sites over here, which were founded from Iona. So by 600, there were quite a few monasteries in Britain. Now, I'm bringing up monasteries, even though, as I said, we're going to talk more about them later, because we're going to talk about manuscripts now, the importance of manuscript, and the development of the illuminated manuscript as really a work of art really does begin in Britain and Ireland. And then the tradition really is picked up on the mainland and practiced there. They were made in monasteries. Okay, by 300, the codex had replaced the scroll. Now, scrolls were the common, obviously we know in the ancient world, the method of recording anything, but the codex, which is just a book, meaning taking sheets of, in this case, it's not paper really, as vellum, or just parchment. Parchment is not paper. It's an animal skin, animal hide, and then binding them together, that's called a codex. We just call it a book, but codex is a general term for any bound volume. And of course, we have documents that need to be reproduced, need to be copied. You have scriptures that Christians write out and copy and pass along. And so this was done in a scriptorium, and a scriptorium just means a workshop or space in a monastery where monks copy manuscripts by hand. It was a very important part of their duty, their responsibility. It was a kind of worship. It was a kind of meditation to copy manuscripts. The earliest illuminated manuscript that we have is the Book of Durrow, that has remained to us, is the Book of Durrow. And this is it. And we're going to look at a page from it in a moment. It's the earliest full gospel. The typical books that were copied were, number one, the Gospels. You would often have one book that would have all 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John from the New Testament. Also, the Psalms were often published as separately. Only on the very rarest occasions would you have a whole New Testament, and even rarer would you have a whole Hebrew Bible, New Testament Bible thing, but I will show you one of those. And it's for obvious reasons. These are copied by hand. They're, it takes years to do even, one small volume. Now, nobody knows exactly where this was made. Could have been made in Ireland. It could have been made in the island of Iona. It's somewhere up in Northumberland at one of those monasteries. All we know is that it was in Ireland by the 10th century. And by the 11th century, it was in Durrow Abbey. That's why it's called the Book of Durrow. It's where it's at. We have to have some name. Durrow was one of those founded from Iona, so it's considered a Columban monarchy. Books like these were not meant to be handled and read. These are for display. These are precious materials. These would have been on the altar, and maybe the priest would read something from them, but these were not things you passed around, or they were very precious. There were many, many other written books of the Gospels, but they weren't illuminated like this. They didn't have this kind of care and expense put into them, as these are terribly precious objects, absolutely. And they're generally bifold sheets, which means each, like if this were a sheet of parchment, which is prepared usually sheepskin, goat skin, calf skin was usually reserved to make vellum, which is a high quality parchment. You know, rub it till it's perfectly smooth. And then what you do is you fold it over, and then this would be one page, and then this would be one page. So it's bifold. So the pages are just folded. And you may have seen, they were still doing bifold books in the 19th century. I've seen 19th century books where the pages were folded like that. It's not totally unheard of.
But it would be printed on both sides of that sheet.
Yes, it would be painted one side here and one side here, not on the back. This way you don't have to paint on the back.
But you don't paint on that.
No, you don't
There's
paint
a
on.
blank in the book.
No, there's no blank in the book because you fold this over.
Oh, okay.
And you get this side and this side, and then the blank part's invisible.
All
It's
right.
folded on the inside.
So each page is sort of a double.
Mhm.
Yeah,
They're sewn. They're sewn, hand stitched
oh,
through the calf skin.
and then the other edge doesn't open.
Exactly. It would, this would be stitched and then it would be like this, but there is still a little gap there here between them.
So the fold is on the outside.
Correct. The fold is on the outside. This loose edge would be stitched, so
I mean,
Why would they do
Open.
it that way? Because it's.
As
that's-
opposed
that's
to-
Fairly thick material.
yeah, it is.
Well, the
But
the paint might seep through.
yeah, you don't want this, you don't want,
You couldn't just.
it wouldn't seep through, but you'd have a blank page. This way you don't have any blank pages. Well, I don't know. We'll have to time travel and ask them. They just, they must have known what they were doing because
They had a reason.
they had a
I'm sure they
reason.
had a reason.
I'm sure they had a reason,
Well,
yeah.
it doesn't look like there's a huge number of pages there.
Not in this one, because it's just a gospel book, but there are, they get bigger. Don't worry, they definitely get bigger. This is about, 10, well, I could say it's 10 inches by 6 inches. They're not always big. They're usually fairly small. We'll see larger, but not often. This is a page from the Book of Duro. This is what's known, well, this is not an author page. This is a symbolic depiction of the evangelist Matthew. Well, they're calling it an author page. What developed was the first page of each gospel would have an image of its author. So the first page of the book of Matthew has an image of Matthew. First page of Luke has an image of Luke. Now, this actually tradition goes back to the Roman Empire. Roman books, not religious texts, just Roman books, had a tradition of having an image of the author in the book, like the first page. So they're borrowing this from the Roman tradition to use this way. Now, the first thing that should be evident, now this is vellum, which is of course the highest quality. So it's calf skin. I'm not sure how many calves to make this, but at least it's got to be probably closer to 100 calves to make this book. Bifold, so it's a bifolio. And the style of it is fairly symbolic and stylized. It's fairly abstracted. It's very flat. There's no attempt to make it look like a real person, but you notice the influence, I think, is fairly obvious. It's clearly influenced by animal style from this, metal work that we've been looking at. It has all of the same characteristics, these rich intertwining forms, and there are even animal forms with beaks and the like, the sort of squares that you see insert here. So they're influenced by what they're seeing all around them, which is sort of this pagan tradition of imagery. Now,
Okay.
yeah.
There are two things that grab me about the person displayed.
Mhm.
The haircut and the feet are like Egyptian.
Yeah, yeah.
But what about the haircut? What do you know about why the?
I
why the haircut?
I don't know any, I mean, I don't know anything about why medieval haircuts were often blunt and the like. That's all I know. We don't have photographs. All we have is things like this to know why. It's not totally Egyptian. The feet are Egyptian, but the head is frontal. The Egyptians would have given us a profile head and also, well, we can't really see the legs, but you know, it's a stylized way of showing a person, and the Egyptians did it because it's the easiest way to recognize a profile of a human being, and so it's symbolic of him. So they're not concerned with what something or someone looked like. More advanced styles of manuscript are created in places like Lindisfarne and Jarrow. Here, Benedict wrote the rules. These are all Benedictine abbeys, meaning they follow the rules of Benedict. At Iona, the monks there, and also at Lindisfarne and Jarrow. Lindisfarne is often referred to as the Holy Island. It's actually an island that's slightly off the coast. It looks like it's on the coast in most maps, but it's really an island. Jarrow is not. Jarrow and Wearmouth is actually a double monastery. There are two monasteries that are close to one another. One is dedicated to St. Peter, one to St. Paul, and a very important book is created here at Jarrow, and it will have an influence on Lindisfarne, and that is the Codex Amiatinus. The Codex Amiatinus is the oldest surviving full draft of the entire Bible. It's written in a translation. It's translation of the Vulgate. It's in Latin. They're all in Latin. Latin is the official language of the Middle Ages in Western Europe. Even when these individual sort of tribal groups have their own spoken language, most of the time, the official language and the language of the church, of course, is Latin, medieval Latin. The Vulgate is the official Catholic translation of the Bible, and it was translated by St. Jerome in around, for the Pope, I can't remember when St. Jerome translated, like 4th century, maybe 5th century. And this is a Vulgate, which is still used. It includes both the Hebrew Bible, which Christians call the Old Testament, as well as the full New Testament. There's 2,000 full pages. Now you can see why they don't do this very often, but this was very special. 3 of these were commissioned for the Pope. This is the only one that still exists. It was made in Britain at the Jarrow Monastery. That's what pandect means, the full Old and New Testament. So it's a pandect, a rare pandect. Even the whole New Testament is very rare. And because it was made for the Pope, it was made in what was considered an Italian style, not really a British style. And so you don't see those Celtic swirls and all of the detail. Rather, you see, and we'll talk about this image in more detail in a moment, this image of Ezra compiling and restoring the books of the Hebrew Bible. So something from the Old Testament. And we'll talk about that style in just a moment. 2,000 pages, that's 1,000 leaves with.
Is that one of the pages?
Yes, this would be at the beginning of the book of Ezra from the Old Testament. So it's an author page, 75 pounds, and had to be carried by hand down to Rome. And it's large, 20 by 14 is a good size. It's half a meter high. That's how they describe it. So you can see that if you turned it over and tried to open it, there's no way this is going to lay flat. You're not even going to be able to see the middle pages. So it's a symbolic thing. It's not something you're going to read from every day. You probably couldn't. And the fact that so many of these were symbolic objects, ritual objects, is one reason why so many of them are full of mistakes and errors. Another reason is that many of the monks who copied them from person to person made mistakes. And we're going to see why they made mistakes, because they're very hard to read. And if they couldn't read it, they just sort of, well, I think it says this. And then somebody else says, well, I know. The next person changes it a little more. It's like a game of telephone, right? Where you whisper in somebody's ear. And by the time 5 people repeat it, what comes out at the other end has very little to do with what it really said. And that was a real problem. By 800, they had to take care of this because all the religious texts were a mess. They had to go back to the originals and see what they had. Now, this is interesting. We see Ezra sitting here in very much a believable space, a very 3-dimensional space. This is Roman style. It's influenced by, remember, Roman art was very realistic. And so it's influenced by that, more so than you're going to see in most places in the Middle Ages, where they're rejecting the physical world. But it does begin a motif for author pages. He's sitting, you see him from the side, he's sitting here making notes with his foot up on this stool. In fact, this background image of this big chest with seems to be various codex in it is very similar to paintings that are on the walls of Roman villas. It's very similar to older Roman wall paintings. So that identifies us as Roman. The other things I would point out is we have a page in here of Christ with angels, and it has the 4 evangelists with their symbols. So it's an early use of what will be a standard way of showing the 4 evangelists. Matthew is symbolized by the man. I don't see, okay, here he's winged. This is Matthew and a man with wings. So Matthew's symbol is identified as a winged man. Mark is a winged lion. Luke is a winged ox. And John is always referred to as symbolized by a winged eagle. And that always, why do you have to say winged eagle? I mean, like, eagles have wings. Why? But it's always identified as a winged eagle. You would never say he was symbolized by an eagle. I mean, you just wouldn't do that. In the same way that a winged man is generally called an angel, but they don't do that. It's a winged man and a winged eagle. Anyway, those symbols are going to show up over and over and over again, as we'll see. We do know where that came from, but I'm not sure I have it in my notes who came up with that. I think it was, well, never mind. Wait a minute, it was I found it. These were assigned by Saint Bede the Venerable, who visited Jarrow, and undoubtedly passed that on. Now,
Back there, I want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Does he have a nose?
Does he have a nose?
I can't see well enough to see.
It's hard to see what's, yeah, I think he does. I mean, there's white. It's hard to see because, you know, it's aged and things get rubbed, but I'm sure he had a nose.
Granddaughter makes people from the
Right.
side, but they don't have a nose.
They don't have a nose. Well, I'm sure he had a nose. It's Roman, so they were really, you know, they were really interested in detail. Now we'll come back to why I showed you this book in just a minute, because now I want to look at some of the most famous manuscripts we have, including the very famous illuminated manuscript. I forgot to explain, you know, that once the British art is Christian, we call it Hiberno-Saxon. That term refers specifically to Christian art of this period. So pre-Christian art is just called Anglo-Saxon, but once it's Christian, it's called Hiberno-Saxon. Hibernia is the ancient name of Ireland. That's where the name comes from. So it means Irish English is sort of what it means. And this is the cover. Now, one of the things that continues throughout the Middle Ages is the importance of the covers of these illuminated manuscripts. They are precious objects and precious materials, as you can see here, precious stones, gold, etc. The Lindisfarne is certainly one of the most famous and the most precious of all of them. Symbolic designs on the surface that are reminiscent, but not really a cross. They're just more or less abstract design. But I want to take a look at an author page from this book because there's clear influence from the Codex Amiatinus in the motif, and yet the style is really quite different. What they have picked up is the position of the figure seated like this, the idea that you're showing him actually writing or making notes of some kind with his feet up on some sort of stool. Now, beyond that, we're moving into a symbolic realm. This is not classically influenced anymore. This is not Greco-Roman influence. It's taken out of the real world. The Amiatinus is still placed in the physical world, but now we're back in the Middle Ages with the one on the right. Now let's take a look at this. Author page, its own variation. First of all, it's not set in a real space, although there's some attempt to suggest that bench is three-dimensional as it sort of seems to go back in space, but we don't see it very clearly. This is Matthew, so we see his symbol here, a winged man. It says, Aios it says, O Aios Mattheus. Now, you have to know how to read this. It's Mattheus. This is actually very readable for a medieval manuscript. In most cases, you can't read them this well, as we will see in just a moment. What we have is a Greek word written in Latin letters. This is the word, remember Hagia Sophia, the church of Hagia Sophia? This is the word Hagia. Only now it's written without the H because they're going back to Greek. It's really hard to explain this, the way it's confusing Greek letters, Greek words with Latin letters. In Greek, there is no word H, no letter H. When you have a H sounding Greek, it's identified by an accent mark over the letter. So a word like Hagios, like Hagia Sophia, would begin with an A or an alpha, and then above it would be an accent mark that would tell you, it's called a hard breathing mark, and it tells you to put an H in front of it or pronounce that A, ha. So they're using Latin letters, so they're not using the accent mark, so it just begins with a vowel, but we're supposed to know it's Hagios. Now, the word Hagios in Greek means holy. It also means saint. So Hagios Mattheus is Saint Matthew. They wouldn't use the word saint, they would use the word Hagios. So all it says is Saint Matthew. All that complicatedness says Saint Matthew. Now, what everyone talks about is who's that? You know, who is the guy peeking around the curtain? Now, some people have said that that's Christ, and he's watching. Others have said that it's Moses, and that Moses is holding the old book or the Hebrew Bible, while Matthew is helping to write the new book, and that's why that is closed. So we have some factions that think it's Christ, some factions that think it's Moses. We don't know. There's nothing written that tells you who it is. Personally, I think it's Moses. I don't think they would show Christ like that. It doesn't make sense to me. It makes total sense to me that it's Moses, because you see, and that the curtain might symbolize the curtain that is over the Holy of Holies, where the holy Hebrew books are kept. So it makes sense to me that it's relating to that, but we don't absolutely know that for a fact. Now, it's very, very flat, stylized figures. And again, it's about information, not showing you what he looked like. And there does seem to be a good bit of maybe even Byzantine influence. I want to look at a couple of pages inside the Lindisfarne Gospel. The classic pages, or every manuscript like this, would have what is called the cross carpet page. And that's the one on the left. Sometimes it's called a cross page because you can see a stylized cross, but it also kind of looked like a carpet. So people called it a carpet page. So it's blurry. I'll show you a better one in a minute. I just wanted to show you the two together because they always face one another. And the other one is what's called the incipit page. Both strongly influenced by, again, the animal style of the Anglo-Saxon art. So let's take a look at the carpet page or the cross carpet page. Intricate detail. These are truly works of art. This is, pages like this in manuscripts are one of the places in the Middle Ages where someone could express their creativity. There's not a lot of ability to do that in medieval art, because medieval art is about following patterns and doing things in a prescribed way. But this is one of the few places where an individual had a lot of freedom in terms of just being creative, and they really let it go in manuscripts like these. Books like these would have several different writers who pen the words, and probably several different painters, because in many of the books you could see different styles of painting on different pages, but the detail is incredible. And again, it's the intertwining forms. There are often animals here. I can see bird-like form with an eye and a beak here. That's again right out of those earlier styles. This is painted, by the way, using a water-based paint called glare, which is very similar to tempera. Tempera is basically paint using egg yolk as the binder, right? Tempera, the icons, all those icons we saw in the Byzantine world, those are tempera, which is basically pigment mixed with an egg yolk and water. And the egg yolk is the binder. Egg yolk is all egg, yolk or white, is a natural emulsion and a natural binder. And if you've ever left egg to dry on a plate overnight, it turns into concrete, right? It's a natural emulsion, so it's perfect for paint. So if you're using all these yolks for painting panels, what do you do with the whites? You make glare out of it. So this is the same thing, but it's using the white of the egg so that the colors are not distorted. There's no yellow distorting the colors. It's just egg white. So it gives you these really bright, intense colors that are clearly quite stable if they're taken care of. I think the most beautiful pages are the incipits. And the incipit pages are, again, the first page after the carpet. You have the author page followed by the carpet page, followed by the incipit, the beginning of each book of the gospel. And the incipit means here begins. So, right, well, it says incipit evangelum genealogia Matthew. So it's sort of here begins the gospel. Evangelum, like the evangelist, means the gospel. Genealogia, or the history or story of the life of Matthew. And then it always says the same thing on the pages. Liber, if you can read this, liber generationes ihu Christi fili David fili Abraham. Now, here's the liber. This is the L-I-B-E-R. So there's liber. This is the origin of those majuscules. This is a style. Did I put it on an earlier one? I put it right here. No, I didn't. This is a style called insular. Yes, I did. It's right there. Insular majuscule. Insular meaning comes from an island. That's what insular means. So, and majuscules are capital letters. That's the term for capital letters. It's still a word we use today. So insular majuscules refers to the style of capital letters that was created in the British Isles. It's literally what those words mean. And they're all capitals. There are no lowercase letters here, which is one reason why it's hard to read. The other reason it's hard to read is there was absolutely no standard way of making a letter. There was no rule that said a C has to look like this. and an M has to look like this. People made it up. Now, sometimes you can read the letter, sometimes it has little or no relationship to what that letter should be. So this is GENERATIONIS. That's an S. So this is a vague relationship to an S. I mean, I can see sort of it's like an S. Ihu, IHU. And then this is one of the most interesting. See that is not an X as you would find in Latin. That is a chi, which you would find in Greek. So this is chi rho iota. That is not a Latin word, that's a Greek word. We're going to see it everywhere. Christi, K-R-I, the first three letters, the name of Christ. So in Latin, when they want to say the word of Christ, they jump back to the Greek and say Christi, chi rho iota. And there's also a chi rho iota page, as we'll see in another manuscript. So we've jumped back to Greek. Now we go back to Latin again. Chi rho iota. Here's Fili. Can you see? Now it starts getting hard to read. This is an F, F-I-L-I-I. So one eye is on top of the other. David, so this is a D, and inside the D is an A-V-I, and that's another D, even though it looks like an O. This is really fun. I love this one because I love Greek. But here we've got for Fili, the first time Fili is written, it's F-I. Here, let's save time and just use the Greek phi, and then we don't have to write the letters F-I. So if they're thrown in a Greek phi, so then read that as F-I-L-I-I, Abraham, A-B-R-H-A-M. See, perfectly readable if you know how to read the letters.
Looks like they ran out of space, like we sometimes run into.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. You'd think, you know, something this precious, we might plan a little bit, but and they have no problem whatsoever breaking in the middle of words at odd places, carrying them down to the next, and there's no break between words. You can't see where a word begins and ends. They're all capital. Half the letters don't even look right. Here's some of the detail again of the animals. Look at the tiny little detail. The other thing I want to point out is notice these handwritten notations. These were handwritten by a monk named Aldred around 1000. He went through and made notations. And what he did was he translated it into Old English. This is Old English. Frankly, I find the Latin easier to read than the Old English. I can't read any of the Old English except for one word. Right here, I can see the word Godspeller, which is the German word for gospel. Godspell is German for gospel. So in Old English is pretty much German. I mean, English is a Germanic language. It started out as German. So that's the only word I can read. None of the others.
He wrote that on the page.
Yep, he wrote that on the page. And we're glad he did. You know, on the one hand, he defaced it. On the other hand, this is now the oldest existing scripture in English. This is the oldest English scripture that we have. And it's really just, you know, scribbled in the margins, but it's still important. And it's all through the book that he did this. Briefly, I'm not going to talk about any detail, but it's my favorite author page. So I wanted to show you St. Luke's. This is also Lindisfarne. So here we get the ox, the winged ox, and it says the same thing, Ios Lucas. And he's writing sort of on a scroll, but it's such a beautiful image. I wanted to show you this page of St. Luke. And his incipit, this is St. Luke's incipit, which is I think entirely a different hand from St. Matthew's. Again, it says, you know, incipit evangelum. Now it says secundum Lucan. Secundum means according to. So here begins the gospel according to Luke. And it's different, you know, it says seeing that many others have undertaken to draw up accounts. It starts differently, but it's the book of Luke and it's coming along a little bit later. It's still just as complicated. This, by the way, this is quidem. That's an M. That thing at the end of the line right there, that's, you're supposed to know that's an M. You're supposed to know that. It's beautiful, but it has, you can see, like he took an M and turned it sideways, and I kind of see where it came from, but it's a problem. But look at the detail, look at the little dots. That's what makes this page different from the others. Little animals down here, again, these bird things. Here's a cat. We're going to see that in another manuscript in just a minute. I'll show you why that is. But you can see Aldred's notations down here in Old English. And while I can see the letters, I can't make any sense whatsoever out of it. And then the last book I want to show you is in many ways, the most famous and considered the greatest, which is the Book of Kells. The Book of Kells was created, we know, in Iona about 800s. It's a little later. This is the same time as something else going on in the mainland, by Irish monks. And when it was made in Iona, but when the Vikings attacked Iona in 806. They also attacked, and the Vikings are coming in. Lindisfarne is sacked, but all the monks leave. They take all the precious books and they leave. Most of them go over to Ireland, which is a good thing. And the Book of Kells was taken to Kells. That's where it gets its name. It was made in Iona, taken to Kells and preserved there. It was stolen from there fairly early on, had apparently a magnificent cover. They found the book thrown in a ditch, and the cover was gone. So the thieves just wanted the cover. That's what was, gold and precious stones. And fortunately, they saved the book, but the cover has been missing from forever. And this is now what's called the Cairo Iota page. And it's the page that says, in St. Matthew, where he says, Christ is born. It's basically screaming those words. And it's a really, really good example of graphic design. Graphic design students, when they study graphic design history, you've got to go back to these manuscripts, because this is beautiful graphic design. This is a perfect matching of the words and the meaning of those words. And this is the page that's the most exuberant and the most powerful. So you get these massive letters. This is the Chi, Rho, Iota. Again, Cairo Iota, Christi, or the name of Christ. So Christ is born. And down here, Autum Generatio, which basically, you don't have to write the whole word autum, just put an H. So there's just an H, generatio. Usually translated, or what it says in Matthew is, now the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, took place in this way. So it's just saying Christ is born. It's symbolizing that line. And then you move into the rest of the book. But the detail is stunning. A lot of little figures here. Look at the tiny little swirling forms. A lot of gold and gold leaf here. Technically, to be called an illuminated manuscript, it has to have gold leaf. But when we really use the term a little more broadly, the cats down here, the rats that are fighting over, this is a holy wafer. So it's the body of Christ. It's a sacred relic, and the rats, I don't know where it is, but somewhere in the Bible, Satan is referred to as a rat. And so rats are often symbols of Satan. And so they're trying to destroy Christ, and the cats are trying to stop the rats. And there's a rat over here with a fish in his mouth, again, trying to destroy Christ. These are tiny. I mean, when you look at the page, way down here, here's the little rat with the fish, and here's the cats and the rats. You almost can see them. And just because it's so beautiful, I just want to show you quickly some other pages from this book, and you can see different hands in them. This is this is the John, the incipit. I mean, where's the text? It's like, okay, There's a little text here. I'm sure there's some text in here somewhere, and John's up here somewhere, but it's all just this beautiful detail. Christ in majesty, where we get, again, the four evangelists symbolized here. And here's some detail. You know, many of the pages are text like this. You know, they're not all these completely illuminated pages. It's mostly text like this, but it's really beautiful. And they're going to have designs like this on the page. Whoever this is an incredible artist who would come up with this sort of asymmetrical design with the wonderful birds and creatures, a lot of gold, just little flourishes like this on the pages.
2 summers ago, the Nelson had an animated film out on the lawn, just east of the building, the new building. Did you all go see that? I went.
No, I didn't.
Oh, we really didn't understand it, but it was about this.
Wonderful.
The creation of this book, an
Wow.
animated film.
Wow. Interesting. Animated. Here's another fish out here. Okay. So this is all beginning in Britain. And the style and the tradition and the need for manuscripts is growing. What's happening on the mainland is the Franks have been united. There's a dynasty of Franks who have been gaining power. And one of them, Carolus Magnus, manages to unite most of the kings of the different tribes of the Franks into a single unit. Carolus Magnus is his Latin name. His French name is Charlemagne, and in English is Charles the Great. We usually know him as Charlemagne, but Carolus Magnus was really what he was known as at the time, and that's usually in most of the texts he's referred to as that, which is why it's called the Carolingian world and the Carolingian Empire, the Empire of Carolus Magnus. When he united the Franks, he had in his mind the goal of, in fact, his official motto on buildings and other things was Renovatio Imperii Romani, renovation of the Roman Empire. He absolutely saw himself as the Roman emperor. So there are still people that consider the Roman Empire going strong, and Charlemagne certainly did. He took on that role and he looked to Rome as a model for a great many things. He also, in the Carolingian, when the Franks are united and you no longer have just all these disconnected tribal groups, we're beginning on a path, and he's really establishing the beginning of feudal Europe. This is really when the feudal system begins, because you can look at it. You can look at a map like this and it can be labeled the Empire of Charlemagne, but don't assume that that means he actually controlled all of that area. He totally did not. It was a decentralized government. His capital was in Aachen, which is in modern day Germany. And what he had was the allegiance of the tribal leaders of all of these other tribes. This is basically what we call the feudal system. Feudal system is decentralized. In other words, just because there's somebody who's called the king, there are hundreds of these other feudal lords of the manor, former kings of different tribes. They all swear their loyalty to one man, but on their territory, they are in absolute control. Charlemagne couldn't go down in someone else's territory and take charge. You know, that feudal lord is still the lord of his land, and he owns all the land, and everybody living on that land is owned by him too. They are serfs. And he owns all the towns, villages, monasteries, everything else. That's the feudal system. And it's really established at this point in time, and it's a decentralized government. It's not a bureaucracy. And the important thing about the rise of the Christian church in Europe during this period is that the church becomes so powerful because they are the only centralized bureaucracy in Europe. They are the only institution in Europe that has a central bureaucracy, one person at the head, and then people below that answer to him, people below them that answer to them. It's unified in a way that the governments are not. And that's why the church has so much power in terms of what they're able to do. And the monasteries play the most important role in that system, as we're going to see. So when Charlemagne unites the tribes, he understands the symbolism of what it means to be considered a Roman emperor. And so he goes to Rome and has himself knighted and crowned by the Pope, and therefore identifies himself, and the Pope identifies, Pope actually says this, that he is the rightful successor to Constantine. That's key. Remember the role of Constantine, the last Christian emperor of Rome. He's still seen as the founder of this new Christian empire. Well, if Charlemagne can get someone to certify him as the only true successor of Charlemagne, that's powerful. That means you're a Roman emperor and head of the church in this part of the world anyway. So it's very important. This was not popular in the Eastern Empire. Remember, Byzantium, pardon me, now Constantinople's still out there. They consider themselves the successors of Constantine. Constantine moved his capital to Constantinople. They're in Constantinople. They are the successors of Constantine. And now you've got this guy out here in this barbarian Germany who's claiming to be the only true successor. So the church hasn't split in two, but they're clearly on very different paths very early. You know, in the East, they don't want anything to do with the Pope. They don't care that the Pope says you're the successor of Constantine. Our claims are that Constantine came here and built this city. We really are the descendants of Constantine. So a lot of antagonism between East and West here. A lot of split is taking place. So Constantine has big ideas. He wants reforms. He says things are wrong. Number one, we have all these problems in the church. We have all these manuscripts that nobody can read. Nothing is uniform. So he sets out and passes in 789 what's called the Great Admonition. And the Great Admonition was to correct these books, correct the Psalms. What it was defined as, here's what it says. It's to correct the Psalms, the signs in writing, the songs, the calendar, the grammar, and the Catholic books. He says people pray badly because of faulty books. And so he sets this whole team of people. Let's go back to the sources. Let's look at what these books say. Let's check everything and let's write them in a uniform script. He sets out, here's what an A looks like. Here's what a B looks like. Now, use those to define, and also creates a script called Carolingian minuscules. Now we have a set of capital letters and small letters that allow you to distinguish beginnings of words, beginnings of sentences. These are supposed to be readable, not, mysterious things that nobody can read. And therefore, now when they get copied, people are going to know what they say and they're going to copy what they actually say. So setting that out and changing all of this is very important. To do this, he needs to set up a whole host of scriptoria and workshops, and sets up royal workshops, not just monks, but just hires professional artists in the workshops to do this. So it's a huge project, and out of it comes a real tradition of manuscripts and a new style. Actually, there are several different styles. And when I just look at one author page from the so-called Coronation Gospels, this is a gospel book commissioned by Charlemagne for himself. It's his personal book. It later was used for generations as a book, not the Bible, but as a gospel used in the coronation of later emperors. And so it became known as the coronation gospels, but it wasn't called that when he commissioned it. It was just his gospel book. It was the gospel book of Charlemagne, but we know it as the coronation gospels. It's quite different. This is actually an incipit page. It's on this purple. This is the emperor now. So this is a royal purple. This color of purple, which is very expensive and very rare because it comes from mollusks, these very rare mollusks, which are like a little shellfish. That's why they're on this purple with gold lettering. But look, the straight lines, minimal decor, because this is about reading it. And of course, gold cover. But what I want to look at is this author page, because it's very much returning to the classical style that we saw in the Codex Amiatinus, where there's much more of a sense of space here, landscape. What's particularly classical about it is the suggestion of a physical, like solid three-dimensional form. He's got shading and highlighting behind him. It's not in this ornate decorative background, but seems to be almost like a landscape. It's still following the motif, but he's actually sitting on furniture that's of a Roman style, because he wants you to think of Rome. He wants to connect to Rome. So his whole gospel book is very Roman in this way. But he's not the only one, and this is not the only place where gospels are being made in the Carolingian period. Not too far from Aachen in Reims in northern France, there is a monastery headed up by the Bishop Ebo, and he commissioned a gospel book from the workshops at Reims, and it's in what's called the Reims style, which is a very different style from the style of Charlemagne, because he doesn't care about empire or connecting to Rome, and it's much more influenced by the Hiberno-Saxon style, and it's absolutely beautiful. It's called the Ebo Gospel because it was made for Bishop Ebo, and it's just stunningly beautiful. It's a beautiful balance between the sort of clarity. Look at the clarity here. This says the same thing as the Lindisfarne we tried to read. Incipit Evangelium. Here begins the gospel, secundum, according to Matthew, liber generati. It's the same words, but now in perfectly readable letters, beautiful letters. And across from it is the author page, this style or this image of Matthew. Well, before we look at Matthew, let's compare. This is the incipit. We still get the large L and the large I as decoration, but here it's just readable and simple. The author page, comparing the two, is interesting because same motif, little bit of that sort of reference here, but look at this frenzied line. The Ebo style is very emotional. It's very energetic. It's like he's writing and he's writing so fast, and it's like coming down from the heavens. There's like his symbol up here is like a winged man again. It's Matthew, but it's like this figure is in the heavens and dictating down to him, and it's coming through him, and he's writing as fast as he can. And there's a calligraphic quality to the line. It's like write as fast as you can. And so he's all energy and he's all emotion, and it's a very different, clearly a very different style from that staid style on the left of the Lindisfarne. And even the sort of landscape he's in has that energetic line. It's a beautiful book, but you can see various styles are developing in various places during this period. So side by side, two Carolingians, 25 years apart. The difference has nothing to do with the 25 years. It's the difference between what Charlemagne personally wanted to say versus the Reims style that developed that Ebo liked. So it's two different styles. The dates are more or less overlapping. there's an earlier book called the Utrecht Psalter. Psalters were also really popular books. The Psalms were very popular. And it has this very linear style. And some people believe it was also made at Reims. So it has this linear style. And there's a lot of the images where they have a lot of movement in them and energy. And a lot of people think that, you know, the Utrecht Psalter influenced this. They're both Reims style. So the covers, okay, let's talk a bit about covers. We saw one. This is the cover of the Landau Gospel. There was, believe it or not, actually a market in the Middle Ages for covers like this that had nothing to do with the book. It was just a cover. And people would just set them. You would have like a box that looked like it was a manuscript, and then you put the cover on top and you leave it out. It's like a coffee table book. So it looks like you have an expensive manuscript when you don't. But this actually was a real cover from a set of Gospels. And I want to look at it because it's an image. Okay, here we get a symbolic form that you could interpret as referencing the idea of a cross, if you want to interpret it that way, loosely as a design. Here we get something that is more clearly a cross. Now, I said last time that images of the actual crucifixion were extremely rare before 1000. And this is a rare image of a figure that I think we have to ask, is this an actual crucifixion or is it not? When does an iconic image become a narrative image? Now, iconic images are what we see mostly in Christian art. We've seen a lot of, you know, a cross is an iconic image. Iconic image is when a simple image stands for an idea or a big idea. And a cross is the classic iconic image in Christianity. A simple cross stands for huge ideas. But at what point does that icon become the narrative, which is the story of what happened to a specific person? Now, this does have a figure, but he's not in a landscape. He's in what we would expect, a gold-leaved, timeless spiritual realm, as we saw in Byzantine art. And he seems to be kind of standing there with his arms out, more than he's literally hanging on a cross. So it's sort of halfway between. It's sort of showing us the direction we're going to go. But I would not call this a scene of the crucifixion, because it's not. No hillside, nothing that suggests the narrative of it, but it's a transitional. So we're getting closer. Yes. Yeah, maybe somebody's going to ask. Somebody always asks about those.
I'm talking the
I-
ones that are on the sides of on the arms of the cross.
Oh,
Right at going up.
here?
Yeah.
Yeah, these guys. I don't know. I have no idea. People always want to know. I don't know who these little people are.
Clouds that you just, yeah, you know, they.
Well, they're angels. Here's a wing.
They're trying to do blanks.
So they're just, and maybe they're just generic angels. I don't know that they're,
Have they got wings?
this one does for sure. This is a wing. I can't see it clearly on others, but this is a wing. No, this is a wing. Here's a wing.
Those down below are really weird.
Maybe that's a,
Those that are on the other
But
side.
above the figure's head, is that a sign? It looks
yeah,
like a
it
sign.
always says, I can't remember what it says.
RI, which was on
Yeah,
the cross.
that's usually what it says here. It probably is in Latin. I'm sure that's what it says.
What are those, two clouds above? that?
No, those are people.
Those are
One's
people?
bending over this way and one's bending over that way. So, okay, homework.
Yeah.
See if you can find out somebody talking about what the symbols are on the Landau Gospel, because I don't know. I've never, this is clearly an angel. These are 4 angels. I see wings on these 4. These guys, I'm not so sure about. They're a little weirder. Okay, so what happens? the Carolingian dynasty ends weirdly, not after Charlemagne. There's a few more generations of his descendants, but at some point, somehow the empire gets divided. Dividing empires is always fatal. It always ends up badly. And somehow into a Western Carolingian and Eastern Carolingian, and then the East fell to a new dynasty. It fell to a group of Saxons rather than Franks. Technically, the Ottonian Empire is still a continuation of the same empire. It's just a different dynasty of that empire. And they're Saxons rather than Franks, and their capital is further east. And it's called Ottonian. Don't confuse Ottonians with Ottomans. It's easy to do. The Ottomans are the Turks, and they're over in the east. The Ottonians are three guys named Otto. Otto the first, Otto the second, and Otto the third. And that's why it's called the Ottonians. And they're in Germany, or they're in what we now call the Holy Roman Empire. If you look it up, you will find in most places, Charlemagne is identified as the first Holy Roman Emperor. And I can understand that because in many ways he is. He's the first one that identified himself as an emperor of a Christian Roman Empire. But he never used that title. So technically, the Ottonians are the first to use that title. They call themselves Holy Roman Emperors. So in reality, it's probably Charlemagne is correct, but it depends how technical you want to be. But anyway, for sure, by this time, it is known as the Holy Roman Empire. Yeah.
So there's Saxons over here, and then there's Saxons in
England.
What's a Saxon?
It's just a German Dutch tribe that has, it's a tribe, really. It's a tribe of people moved across Northern Europe. And they're primarily Germanic. They become more Dutch as they move into the West. And by the time they get into England, they're identified as sort of Dutch. But it's really just an ethnicity. It's a tribal ethnicity.
But they spoke German.
They spoke Latin.
How about
What their vernacular was, I'm not sure when a language that we could call German and French actually began. A linguist could tell me that. So I'm not sure when this transition from some sort of local tribal vernacular becomes the languages we call French, German, Italian, whatever. They're all, I didn't study linguistics. I wish I had. It would be really interesting. Yeah.
Well, you can see the relationship of the French from the Latin. You don't see that relationship from the Latin to German.
Well, it's because German is more, and English are rooted more in Greek.
Well, even before it gets to England.
Our
German-
roots are more Greek than they are Latin. We have both English and German. German does have some Latin in it, but you're right, not like the Romance languages.
No,
The Romance languages, Italian, French, etc.
Italian, Spanish.
Yes, they are clearly Latin, and you can see it
Right.
clearly. Where the so-called Teutonic languages, which are German, Dutch, English, are not as Latin based, but we do have a lot more Greek words.
But we have William the Conqueror that I thought spoke German.
No, he didn't speak German. William the Conqueror was Norman, and he wasn't German. That I'm pretty sure of.
But when did you get all those kings of England that could not speak?
Oh, that's
English?
later. That's much later.
Okay,
I mean, they're German.
I know.
They're much more
Yeah.
German now than they were then. I mean, they didn't become
Right.
German until much later,
Okay,
but like 18th, 19th century, 19th mostly, actually, but it's later.
okay.
Yeah, because they're definitely German. It's hard to say. I mean, the Franks were German before they were French. So I would love to study linguistics more and really learn more about this. Once again, we have a huge Holy Roman Empire, which was not anywhere near as united as this map suggests. It was broken down into little provinces and areas and that were more or less independent. They were just part of what was called the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire will continue until it is defeated by Napoleon in the 19th century. So there are people calling themselves Roman emperors until the 19th century. So that's when we finally hear the end of Rome. Okay, so let's talk about the Ottonians. The Ottonians, first of all, were much closer to the Byzantine Empire. There wasn't the hostility to the Byzantines among the Ottonians. In fact, Otto II, they not only sort of connected with the Byzantines, but Otto II married a Byzantine princess. And I'm fairly sure he did this for a very important reason. I think he had, well, I know, he had visions of reuniting the East and West. He had visions of bringing these two things back together. And one way to do it is to marry a Byzantine princess. And then in your children would have claim to the Byzantine throne, which is what we will see. Otto III absolutely had a claim to the Byzantine throne. As soon as it became available again, or there was some transition, he was ready to step in and reunite East and West. I want to look not at this. This is a very good example of an Ottonian church, big, heavy, dark. We're going to look at Romanesque a little later, but I really want to look at something, some doors of this church. First of all, it's typical of this period in that it has a heavy westward facing entrance. We have two transepts now, one on each side, big towers at the end. You enter here. It's really a very different design. But what I want to look at are the bronze doors. This church was sort of built by, had the patronage of Bishop Bernward of Hildesheim, and this is the Abbey Church of St. Michael. When a church is referred to as an abbey church, it means that it originally was part of a monastery. Monastery's gone now, it's just a church, but originally was part of a monastic community. The tradition of bronze doors is one that is sort of beginning at this time again, and will continue, through the Renaissance up into the 18th century. In Italy, there are very famous bronze doors. We have a copy of one big important set in the Nelson Gallery, but this is very early. It's actually influenced by earlier wooden carved doors that earlier churches had, particularly the Church of Saint Sabina in Rome. Saint Sabina was actually built not long after the original Old St. Peter's by Constantine himself. And that church still stood at this time. I have no idea if it still does, but it had carved wooden doors that had panels inserted of biblical stories. And so that's what inspired him to do this. Now let's look at what we've got. It's a complicated set of 16 narrative scenes. We've seen works of art that had narrative scenes from the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. When we looked at the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus, one of these very early Christian works of art, we saw that there are various scenes here from the Old and New Testament that set up sort of the ideas of sacrifice and redemption here. But there's not a lot of sort of order to why they're placed where they are. It's not particularly systematic. What we find in these doors is a very complex and ordered and systematic way of looking at the relationship between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. In Kendall's class, one of the things we studied when we were reading the New Testament was how the different authors were setting up different relationships to the Hebrew Bible, how they were interpreting in fact, even just calling it the Old Testament and taking what is basically a Jewish text or the history of the Jews and claiming it as a Christian document is really, takes a lot of nerve to do that. But they did it by interpreting it as a foreshadowing of the New Testament, right? And going in and picking out stories and saying, well, that was talking about the coming of Christ, and that was about this. So it was looking at those stories and finding parallels. And that's what we see happening here in this setup of typologies. Typologies just means linking things based on some theme, putting them together because of themes. Now let's see what we've got. All of the images on the left side, and this is a door, so it opens in the middle. So it's really two tall, thin panels. All of the images on the left side come from the book of Genesis, first book of the Old Testament. You read from the top down chronologically, beginning with the creation of Adam, down to the Abel murdering Cain. It's meant to be seen as the progression of the fall of man. The minute Adam's created, the fall of man begins. This is an idea actually that William Blake will pick up on in his poetry in the 19th century, that the essential fall of man was creation. Creation was, and he's kind of right. I mean, it's the beginning. I mean, what can you say? But even within this, yeah, you're there, so now you're in trouble. That comes along later. That's later. They're grouped in pairs. So the top two are life in paradise, and then the fall, the temptation and fall, and accusation and judgment. We're going to look at those two actually. And then life in the world, and then Eve's children. And then so you read it down, and it's formally down, like the fall of man from the top down, literally falling. And then you cross over, and now you read up. Now we're in the New Testament. So now we start with the Annunciation, and we go up from there, all the way up to the ascension of Christ, the return to heaven. Now they're all related across as well. This is the typology. So at the bottom, you've got Eve's children and the fall of man, and now Mary's child, starting with the Annunciation. Not only is the pair united, but the individual ones are as well. So these are despair, sin, and murder versus hope and everlasting life. So you can see the connection. Abel's sacrifice versus the nativity, Lamb of God, all the way up, they're connected. Accusation and judgment of Adam, judgment of Christ, so that's judgment, and all the way up to here, the first and the last, where we get paradise lost, paradise gained. So it's a complicated look at every single one of these stories, how they thematically relate, and how I can show you, one is the fall and one is the rise, the redemption. It's really quite brilliant the way they're put together. These are actually cast in two solid pieces. This is the door on the right is one solid cast bronze piece, and the door on the left is one solid. Where are they? I think they're still in that church. I think they're still in the church at Hildesheim in Germany. Where was it?
These doors of paradise were until 14 something.
Yeah, they're Renaissance, early Renaissance. These are just after 1000.
And that's in the Church of St. Michael
at Hildesheim,
in
Germany.
So that sort of starts it.
Because their Ottonians are definitely German. Let's take a look at one set that are across from one another, and how they're linked and stylistically linked as well as thematically. So on the left, we've got the temptation of Adam and Eve from the Old Testament is directly across from the crucifixion in the New Testament. So let's look at the design of the scene. We get the cross here, and this is after 1000. So this is, now we're seeing scenes of the crucifixion, scenes of the Passion of Christ, and in the center. and symmetrical figures on either side. Here we get the tree of life, which if you look at it is suspiciously like a cross in form. And there are references, biblical references that link the cross of Christ to the tree of knowledge, that in fact, it was made from the wood of the tree of knowledge, which is said somewhere. I don't know where, I just know it says it. And you've got Adam and Eve here. You've got other trees framing here, other figures here. It's very formally similar. So when you look at them, they're visually united as well as thematically united. They tell interesting stories. I love the way this one tells a story. Okay, this is the one we just looked at. And now we're looking here, the accusation. And I love this image because it's so medieval in the way it tells the story. It has almost cinematic quality to it. You're meant to sort of read it across the picture plane. So this is Christ swooping in. There are no images of God in medieval art. If you want to depict God, you depict him in his physical form of Christ. So this would be Christ / God, because of the Trinity, they're all the same thing, right? So we have him sort of swooping in from the left, and this diagonal is interesting. It kind of suggests he's swooping in, and he's accusing Adam. He's pointing at Adam. So then Adam covers himself and points at Eve. Eve then covers herself and points to the not yet serpent. So what you're seeing is first this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens. And we know that because this creature has not yet been turned into a serpent. That happens afterwards. It's a progression here of narrative. It's cinematic. It's as if it's like you're looking at different cells of a scene and moving your eye across. It's not like take it in all at once. Here's a frozen moment. That's not it. It's not a single frozen moment. This moment is followed by that moment, and that moment. And that's a very medieval way of storytelling. They often do that, having sort of unfolding in front of you.
Well, now that was the serpent, but it was not a snake.
It was not as, no, it was
It looks
I
like a
can't
chicken.
remember what the Bible called it, but it was a creature on 4 legs that walked on 4 legs, and God cursed it to crawl on its belly like a snake. And that's when it became the snake. Unitarians, read your Bible. I say that when I had never read it. That's why I took Kendall's class, because I wanted to know what was in it. And I was really surprised at what was in it.
That's because
But I did know that
Because
story.
Unitarians used to go to Christian churches.
Yeah, yeah.
Before they got.
You learn a lot when you study art. I mean, I mostly learned it studying art history, because then, I would have to go in and read sections of the Bible. My mother got real excited once when I was in grad school. She saw me reading a Bible. She went, "Oh my God," because she knew, me, and knew that, I wasn't going to read a Bible. But she got real excited, and I said, "I have to read it. I'm working on this painting and I need to know what this passage is." You have to read what the artist read, you have to know what they knew. So yeah, I read a lot of the Bible, but I was reading it just to see the description and the like. But anyway, she got all excited because I was reading a Bible. Hallelujah.
You've been saved.
No, I was, I'm not. They gave up. Eventually. And one final one I want to look at out of the third. Now remember, his mother was the Byzantine princess. So out of the third, absolutely expected to be an emperor of a unified East and West. And he was quite young. Unfortunately, he died very young. He died actually on a trip to Rome, but he had had a lot of interaction in Constantinople. He was really set. If he hadn't died young, that's another one of those what if moments. That would have been really interesting. What if the East and West had reunited? They didn't, so we'll never know. But you see it in this image. This is actually a page that was made for his gospel book, the one that he commissioned. And it's an image of him on a throne holding, this is an orb that actually goes back to Charlemagne. Actually, so does this bird thing. You see, even Napoleon with these symbols, they want to connect themselves to Charlemagne, and through them to back to Constantine. So in France in particular, these are common symbols. We see him in the middle facing us in this very typical now kind of standard medieval way of showing the figure. It's very stylized, very flat. And we see over here the barons and landowners that he is dependent on for support. Over here, the officials of the church that he is dependent on. And there's no question whatsoever that this is directly influenced by this image of Justinian, which, remember, while it was a Byzantine mosaic, was located in Ravenna, Italy, a place where Otto had visited many times. What he's doing is linking himself to Justinian. And why does he want to link himself to Justinian? Justinian in the middle with the church officials, the secular figures here. He brought in some soldiers, which we don't have over here, but we do have a sword here suggesting that these secular landowners. He wants to be put in the middle of these because he wants to be linked to Justinian. Why Justinian? Justinian was the last person that united East and West. Justinian did reunite the East and West temporarily, and not all of it, but parts of Italy were united briefly with the East. Now Otto wants to do the same thing. But if Otto did it, it would be all of Europe. It wouldn't just be Southern Italy. It would be all of Europe united. So this is a clear political commentary that we have here. And one last really special Ottonian piece. Crucifix, a real crucifix, 970. One of the first and a real one. And the reason we have it, and it is so realistic, is because it's German. One of the things we're going to continue seeing, if you were in the modernism class that just finished, one of the things we looked at was, I talked about was that German art is the most emotional and passionate art in the Western world. And it always was. German art is very expressive, and it goes back to the Middle Ages, and you see it here. This is known as the Garo crucifix. It was commissioned for Archbishop Garo, and it's painted wood. It's the oldest surviving life-size sculpture of the crucifixion, because wood doesn't really last that long, and it is absolutely Germanic. It's carved in oak in the round, painted. It's actually a reliquary. Now we're going to talk more about reliquaries coming up, because we're moving into the period of the cult of the holy relic. But a reliquary is any object that holds a holy relic. So this must hold a holy relic somewhere. This is associated with miracles. And what happened was, after it was made, shortly after it was made and consecrated, it developed a crack. Now, I don't understand why, but for some reason, because it had been consecrated, it could not be repaired. I don't know what that means. You can't do something, you can't, I know it's consecrated, so, hands off. So anyway, what Garo did was he took a consecrated host, the wafer host, and a piece of the true cross, in quotes, and he shoved them into that crack. And guess what? It's sealed up. So it's a miracle. Absolutely, it's a miracle. Assuming there ever was a crack. It's not there now. But if there was, and if he did that, there would be a consecrated host inside of this. Therefore, it's a reliquary, because the body of Christ is a holy relic, and the consecrated host is considered a holy relic. This has been throughout most of history very controversial because people refuse to believe this was from 970. It's too realistic, right? I mean, instinct says this can't be medieval. This has got to be at least Renaissance. It's got to be at least 500 years later. Well, that argument was finally put to rest in 1976 when they did a dendrochronology study of the wood and confirmed the date of 970. So it's miraculous. But when you see other German art of this period, it's also very realistic. German art is the first really realistic medieval art. They're moving in that direction very early on. And I think it's because they just never had that. Well, no, I don't want to say why. I don't want to get into that because it's undoubtedly too complicated. So I'm not sure why. I think it's the desire to be emotional and passionate. It's just the direction that they chose. It's German tradition.
Do you know where it is now, where it's located now?
Nope. Homework.
It's a beautiful piece.
It is. It's really beautiful. It's stunningly beautiful. And we just have a few minutes, so I'm going to do like an introduction. Still behind, I can't seem to get caught up to the Romanesque. Roughly, it depends where you are. You know, we give these dates, like this period ends here and this period begins, but understand those are all very arbitrary. Nothing happens overnight. Plus, things don't happen at the same time in every place. So Southern Europe, things are changing. Northern, maybe they're not. So there's an overlap here. Romanesque is starting in the West, in Western France, while the Ottonian is still going on in Germany. This period, the Romanesque, which means Roman-like, and we'll see why, it has to do with architectural style, which is reviving aspects of Roman architecture, is really punctuated by four really important things. The Crusades, which I'm not going to talk about in any kind of detail. The growth of monasticism, which I am going to talk about because art is directly related to that. The pilgrimage movement, which you cannot separate from the pilgrimage church design, which is also connected to the growth of monasticism. They're all sort of a single piece. And also part of that, the revival of large-scale sculpture. And we already saw it beginning, you know, in 970, that large sculpture in Germany, but we're going to see it in other places. There's considerable overlap between the Romanesque and the Gothic. Again, depending on where you are, those are architectural styles. Things changed dramatically in the Romanesque period. What we have is a new, almost apocalyptic vision that enters Christianity. Christianity changes quite dramatically after 1000. And one of the reasons for that is the fact that a lot of people in the Christian world thought that the world was going to end at 1000. I mean, it's in the scriptures, actually.
What was that?
Yeah.
Y2K?
Y2K, right. Well, we thought the computers were going to end the world. Well, the thing is, the reason they didn't is because a lot of very diligent people worked very hard to update computer software. Because my brother was one of those. He worked very hard doing that. He said, the people laugh at it now as if that were never going to happen. He said, it didn't happen because we rewrote all the software and it was a huge job. Yeah, he said he had no doubt that, you know, the world wouldn't have ended, but there would have been a lot of problems. Anyway, because of that, when the world didn't end, it ushered in this sort of intensity, almost this religious fervor, like, oh, now that the cult of the holy relics, the pilgrimage movement, all of these things come in, and Christianity becomes much darker than it was before. This is when the passion, the crucifixion, the suffering of Christ, this is all emphasized. It's very, very dark and very different from the first 1000 years of Christianity, which were much lighter.
Well, I remember, and it really was an opener for me, that you said the first 1,000 year or early Christianity was mostly poor people and slaves.
That's how it
And
began.
that's how it got so powerful, because there were so many of these people.
It-
And then the rich people took it over.
Yeah, but at the time of Constantine, when Constantine converted, that was it. That's the sign. Okay, everybody starts converting. Once it's all about power, it's all about who has and who doesn't have power. Once they recognize power shifting because of numbers to the Christians, people jumped on board. And then, you know, now it was in the hand, Christianity's in the hands of the powerful, and it becomes a state religion and everything else. This is what happens at the time of Constantine.
It got so institutionalized.
Yeah,
That's what's going on right now.
Yeah.
Far right.
Yeah.
Christianity.
well, I think it's 3, so we'll call it a day. But we'll start next time with this and the Romanesque, and really talk about monasticism and all of these different things. So
Is that the border of France and Germany now?
oh, no, it's way over.
That's what I thought.
No, it's way over here. And there's all kinds of countries up in here. No, that's not it now, but you do see at 1100, though, Muslims are in Spain, controlling a good part of Spain. And that's going to be an important part of the story for the history of art.
You know, I'm a German heritage, but
Yeah.
I've always thought the Germans must have been just like Neanderthals, but you're telling me they had some.
Oh.
Germans.
They weren't any less sophisticated than anybody else. You're thinking of the Germanic barbarians at the time of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
First of all, they weren't that. I mean, the Romans painted this picture of them that way. They were never that.
I'm feeling better than.
Good. I'm Germanic too. I'm Swiss, actually,
You're a
but
Hun.
Germanic Swiss, whatever. Anyway, does anybody have any other questions or anything? Questions, comments, anything?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Okay, we're at the height of the Middle Ages now, so next time we'll talk. I love the monastic world and
You didn't do anything about the Dark Ages.
well, the Dark Ages there's no such thing. The Dark Ages is just another name for the Middle Ages. They used to call it the Dark Ages, but there is no such thing. We're called, well, in the Renaissance, they made that name up in the Renaissance. The Renaissance made up that word. They called themselves the rebirth of civilization, and they said everybody before us just lived in a dark age. And we continued doing that for a long time. We used that terminology until people really started studying it and realized that there's no such thing as the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. That's just a prejudiced terminology that intentionally denigrated a period of time.
We was raised in history.
Oh, maybe. The name of that animated movie was The Secret of the Kells, and it is about a young boy who protects his manuscript from an attack. It's an I bet you it's on Netflix.
Well, then maybe it's got to do with that when it was stolen, that time when it was stolen.
I don't know.
Maybe he's the one that got it
But
back or
it's on
something.
Netflix if you care to see it.
And what's it called again?
The Secret of the Kells.
The Secret of the Celts.
Weirdly animated, it's not your normal.
Did you see it?
Weirdly
Yeah.
animated.
Nelson?
The
Yeah, me
Secret of the
too.
Celts.
It's in the Cologne Cathedral in Germany, that cross. and it now
Okay.
looks like
Oh, it
this.
is.
It's,
What
they've got
happened?
this
Oh, that's
fancy.
amazing.
Oh.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's
Yeah,
some
we-
reason
we-
to believe that was original or if they just made it up.
That movie
Well,
was
thanks,
great.
everybody.
Thank
Bye.